All right, we are ready to deal with our study of leadership. This is our second installment of that. If you were not here last week, a little catch up here just in a moment of what we're doing and where we're going and what our plans are. Tonight our focal point is on Nehemiah. Hopefully you've spent some time reading from Nehemiah from our mentioning of that last week. If not, then perhaps your familiarity with that will help us as we go through. Nehemiah indeed was an outstanding leader. A little reminder of what our purpose and our goal here is in this study. We're trying to develop future leaders, both those in the immediate future that we'll talk about in a moment, and some who are younger, who may be 15, 20 years away from leadership positions, and yet developing some skills where they'll be ready when that time comes. But also prepare women, maybe to be leaders in their home, but more importantly in this study, preparing wives, future wives of leaders, so that you can understand fully what is going on in leadership roles for the husband if he becomes an elder, and furthermore to help all the rest of us, whether we may be in leadership or have a husband in leadership, to understand what elders deal with as leaders. Hopefully this will be helpful to us all. A reminder, I'm not going to spend much time with this, but we hope throughout this series that you'll be looking out among us and thinking of future leaders, future elders, and looking at particularly those that might be in that position you think could develop into that within the next 1 to 3 years and within the next 3 to 5 years. And get back with the elders, and we'll talk more about that toward the end of our study. So don't be turning the names in just yet. We'll give you all the heads up on that toward the end of this study. All right, well, the second study is going to deal with Nehemiah. The next three are going to deal with visions, plans, and answers. And then we'll get to the rest of those a little bit later. But that's where we'll be next week, visions, plans, and answers. So let's open our Bibles to the book of Nehemiah. Let's spend some time in Nehemiah. And then we're going to come to the scenarios that we dealt with in the handout, or will deal with in the handout just a little bit later. Nehemiah was an outstanding leader. And so we cite him, though there are other examples of leadership, Moses, Abraham, any one of the apostles. But Nehemiah was an outstanding leader. Let's put him in context. He is in the post-exile period. He came back in the third group, which would be about 445 BC. Remember, they went away in groups, came back in groups. And so there are two groups have already come back. Ezra is already back. And Joshua and Zerubbabel have been working already. The temple has been finished, has been rebuilt and completed, though there had been a delay in that. And by the time Nehemiah gets on the scene, the walls of Jerusalem are still in ruins. So the mission and the message of Nehemiah is to rebuild the walls. That would have been a monumental task if he had had no opposition at all. If everyone in the nations around and within his own working group had worked and cooperated with him, that would have been a monumental task to accomplish in the first place. But he did have opposition from the outside, to the north and to the south. He had problems to deal with from within, and he still finished the wall in 52 days, which means he didn't have a building inspector, is what that means. He finished it in 52 days. And got it accomplished in spite of all the problems and all the opposition. He still finished it in 52 days by everybody working, as we see according to chapter 3. All right, the book of Nehemiah has two major sections. There's the reconstruction of the wall, chapters 1 to 6. There's the reinstruction of the people, chapters 7 to 13. Both are a part of the work of Nehemiah. We got a wall to build, a physical, literal wall to build. He has problems along the way, and once that gets finished, we're not through with Nehemiah as a leader. He has to reinstruct and bring them back to the Word of God and reinstruct them in the way of the Lord. All right, let's talk about Nehemiah as a great leader. What makes Nehemiah a great leader? What stands out in your mind as a leadership quality that you see in Nehemiah? All right, he led by example. His priority was with God, okay? Absolutely. He was led by God. He turned to God. What else would you say about Nehemiah as a leader? All right. He got an assessment of the problem. He got an assessment of who could work and knew the people. He knew the problem and worked all of that together. More about that in a moment. Very good. What else stands out in your mind about Nehemiah? All right. He was a delegator. Had to get it accomplished. Well, that's obvious in chapter 3. What else? What do you see in Nehemiah if you picture yourself, whether you are ever going to be qualified or you're a woman or whatever, if you're thinking, put yourself in the place of one who says, I want to be a leader someday. I'd like to be a leader. What qualities do you see in Nehemiah that you say, that's something I need to imitate? What would it be?
Prayer and trustworthy.
All right, he was trustworthy and he offered prayer before he started to do anything else. Larry?
He was not one that was very emotional. The reason I'm saying that is because when he went to the king recognized his countenance was changed. That wasn't his norm. Normally he is composed. Something was wrong. And so he shows us the stability of his emotions. He wasn't just everywhere. He was the one that was composed.
Good point. Good point. What else? Let's get one or two more and then I'll begin listing 22 characteristics we see. Took charge. It's a take charge kind of guy. One more.
Even though there were people against him trying to get him to stop, he knew he was doing God's will and continued to do it.
Work through the opposition. Let's begin listing several of these things. These are good comments you've made. Some of what you've said are going to overlap with some of these. So we got 22 to run through, and then we got some scenarios to deal with, so we're going to get rolling with the book of Nehemiah. Let's begin listing some of these characteristics. First of all, in chapter 1, I'm going to assume as we go through this, without retelling every chapter and going through every verse, that this crowd is generally familiar with the book of Nehemiah. And so when I call a reference and jog your memory, that's about all we're going to accomplish as far as giving great detail to the text. Let's go to chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. He was the kind of person to whom others brought their problems. And I know he asked, verse 2, but verse 3 said that they said to me that the survivors are left in the captivity and the province and is in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and the gates are burned with fire. Why tell him about that? Well, they told him about that because he was the kind of guy that, apparently, from the rest of the book, that they knew he would know what to do about the problem. He's the kind of guy that could demonstrate that he would have had concern. In fact, he'd already demonstrated his concern for that. He was the kind of guy that had demonstrated, perhaps in the past, that he would have a solution for the problem. I want to suggest there are some guys that you would never take your problem to because you don't ever think they will be one that has a solution to this problem. This is a person who will know what to do about this. You go to the person that you think will have a solution, they'll have some answer. Nehemiah was that kind of person. That made him a leader. Secondly, I want you to notice at verse 2 and 3, same verse, he sought information. Hanani, in verse 2, one of the brethren came back from Judah, and he said, I asked concerning the Jews that had escaped and concerning Jerusalem. What's it like over there? And he said, well, here's the problem. So here's the point. He's seeking out information. He wants to gather as much data and information as he can about what's going on before he poses any kind of solution or sees that he needs to act at all. So he seeks information. Does that make sense? All right, let's go further. Here's a third thing he did. Larry touched on this. He cared and he was bothered. Now notice at verse 4, when he heard this, what did he do? When he got the message, okay, the city the temple's been rebuilt, but the walls are laying flat and still burned with fire. He wept. Yeah. The text says he sat down and he wept and mourned for many days. He didn't jump up immediately and say, I'm taking off to Jerusalem. He sat down and he wept and he mourned. It showed. Larry's already mentioned in chapter 2, 1 to 3, when he went before the king asked, and I'm paraphrasing, something's different here. You look sad. You're really down. Tell me what's going on. It showed that he cared about what's going on at Jerusalem. Chapter 13, this is another circumstance, not the wall, but chapter 13 in verse 8, when he dealt with the sin of the people and realized how sinful things were. Notice in chapter 13 and in verse 8, he said, it grieved me bitterly. He's bothered. Show me a person who's not bothered by problems, and I'll show you somebody that's probably not fit for leadership. His first reaction was that he prayed. We see that in chapter 1. I'm not going to trace through the references in chapter 6. He again prayed in chapter 2, but this is scattered throughout the book, that he prayed, and then he prayed, and then he prayed again. What did he say in these prayers? I'm not asking for the exact words, but what was the point of his prayers? He acknowledged some problems, and we'll come to that in a moment, but then he did something else in the prayers. He asked God for help. Yeah, he asked God for help, which demonstrated his dependence on God, and it wasn't, it's me. It's all about me. They need me over in Jerusalem. They need me. I'm the one that's the answer to all the problems, but rather God is the answer, his dependence upon God. All right, here's another quality. Look at chapter 1 and verse 6. He was humble. How do I know he was humble from these verses, 6 and 7? Two things.
He relates himself to the sins of the people.
Yeah, he relates himself to the sins of the people. In other words, these problems, the reason the walls are laid flat in the first place is because we sinned. We sinned. Not they sinned, we sinned. And so the problem was brought on by us. We've got a problem, and we caused it. So that brings some humility. Secondly, he saw his own weakness and his own limitations in that. When a leader doesn't recognize that he has some limitations, that he can do anything and everything, and he's the all-powerful, he's the only one that can do that, then he's not going to be effective as a leader. He recognized his own limitations. Make sense? That's humility. What's the difference in humility, or let me erase that and rephrase that. We talked about this last time. What's the difference in confidence and arrogance? Was Nehemiah confident? Was he arrogant? What's the difference? Say again. Okay.
He wasn't saying it's all me. He's confident in what he does because he knows where he's getting his power from. It's from God. It's not all him doing it.
Absolutely. But he gives his tribute to God. His confidence is in God. He is confident of what can be done and what will be done, and he's confident in his answers that he gives, but he's certainly not arrogant at all. All right, let's move on to number 6. Look at chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. He puts his trust and his confidence in the promises of God. Now, the promise of God was, and he seems to be alluding, notice at verse 8, that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, probably a reference to Leviticus 26, as seems to be a reference to Leviticus 26 in verses 8 and 9, that God had said, I will scatter you if you're unfaithful, and that if you turn back to me, I'll bring you back to the land. So we're going to come back and we're going to rebuild. And in other words, what he's saying is, I'm confident we can rebuild because you had said in your word that if we turned back, we would rebuild. So he puts confidence in the Lord. What does that have to do with a leader in the present day? God's not made a promise if some walls fall down that they'll be rebuilt. What does that have to do with being a leader in the church?
Sometimes you got to do things that ain't popular with other people, such as withdrawal. God said it would work, and you got to trust in that and believe it.
All right, good point. God said it would work, it'll work. And so we have to have confidence in the promises of the Lord. The Lord said it'll work. This is the Lord's way. God says it's best. We have to have our confidence that it's best. All right? The next one, he was led by God. Look at chapter 2 and in verse 12. This is when he surveyed the city. We'll come back to this a little bit later. He said, I arose in the night and few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put in my heart. What I'm suggesting that text says to us is that he was being led to go to Jerusalem, to survey the circumstance, to rebuild the walls, and that God was leading him in that. Look at chapter 5 and 15. When the problem of usury comes up, he makes the point that, he had not done what other governors had done, taking advantage of the people. And the reason he didn't do that was what? End of verse 15. Because of the fear of God. So I had respect and fear for God. So he was being led by God. God's going to lead us in whatever direction God takes us, that's where we're going. So a leader in the church has to be led by God whatever way he goes. Now, the next 2 points I think are going to be very important. And that is, he had a major goal and he was not sidetracked. He stayed focused. What was his major goal? Chapter 1, 17. If you, let's put Nehemiah in a modern time, and you are the television reporter, and you run up with a camera and a microphone, and you get a chance to ask Nehemiah, Nehemiah, what are you trying to accomplish over here in Jerusalem? Why have you come back? Microphone in your face. What's Nehemiah going to say? 2:17. All right, 2:17. All right, now the question. What did he say? All right. Who said it over here? Rebuild the wall. Rebuild the wall. That's his mission. That's his message. Rebuild the wall. Yeah, chapter 2, verse 17. Let us build the wall of Jerusalem. And the people responded saying, let us rise up and build. All right? Now, chapter 6, and let's just leave it at chapter 6. It may not be 15, but chapter 6 said they did it in 52 days. So what's the point? All right, really what I'm after is that he had a major goal. Yeah, the people had a mind to work, chapter 4, verse 6. But the people had a mind to work, but they didn't have really this mindset until Nehemiah put before them a mission and a goal. Does that make sense? And that is, we need to rise up and we need to build. This is our goal, this is our mission. And he never got sidetracked and he stayed focused. Now, what do I mean that he stayed focused and didn't get sidetracked? Yeah, Sanballat didn't distract him. He was a problem. Tobiah didn't distract him. The internal problems didn't distract him. Yeah, they were problems he had to deal with, but he stayed focused. He had one goal, and he kept that goal in mind, and he never got sidetracked. He stayed focused. When Ronald Reagan came to office, they thought he was inexperienced, and he was in many ways. And they asked him what his policy toward the Soviet Union would be. And he turned to his national security advisor and he said, it's quite simple. We win, they lose. He was ridiculed because it's too simple and we need a more convoluted kind of policy. And he said, no, it's quite simple. We win, they lose. He never lost sight of that focus. Where's the Soviet Union now? Now, that's not a political statement. That's a leadership statement. Here was a man who had the focal point. This is what I'm going to accomplish while I'm in office, and he did. Nehemiah had this leadership principle. I'm going to rebuild the wall. Nobody's going to stop us. And they did. Now, how did he do that? When you've got a goal, what's the next thing you do? Once you get a goal, you've got to have a plan. Nehemiah had a plan for his goal. Let's list some things about his plan. Now, I say they need a plan. Sometimes we come up with goals with no clue how we're going to get it accomplished or whether it can be accomplished. There's a story told in World War I of an Allied officer who called his staff together and said, how do we deal with the German submarines? How do we deal with those? Because they're destroying merchant ships. And one of his staff said, I've got an idea. Why don't we boil the ocean so that the submarines come to the surface? And his commanding officer said, well, pray tell me how we do that. He said, I just come up with the idea. How you do that's up to you. You can have an idea, but what's your plan for getting it accomplished? And so Nehemiah had a plan. Let's look at his plan. Look at chapter 2, verse 5. He didn't wait on other people. What do I mean by that? He goes to the king, and he said, if it pleases the king, if your servant has found favor, I ask that you send me to Judah. What do I mean he didn't wait on other people? He bore the responsibility. How many times have you known someone to say, somebody needs to do something? Sometimes leaders do that. We've got a problem. Something needs to be done. Okay, what are we going to do? Well, I don't know, but something needs to be done. Somebody needs to do something. Nehemiah didn't say that. Nehemiah said, I'm going, and here's what needs to be done. He anticipated obstacles to overcome. Look at chapter 2 and in verse 7. He knew that he needed permission to go through certain areas, to pass through. And so I anticipate there's going to be some conflict, so I need letters to get me there. Chapter 2, verse 19. Notice that he said that Sanballat, he already anticipated Sanballat and Tobiah to the north and to the south are going to be a problem for me and for us. So he anticipated that. Chapter 4, verse 13 indicates even other things that he had anticipated. Something else he had about his plan is how he's going to accomplish it. It's one thing to say, you know what, we're going to do X, Y, Z. How are you going to fund this? Well, I hadn't thought about that. Nehemiah hadn't thought about that. Look at chapter 2 and in verse 8. How's he going to fund this? Where's he going to get the timber? He asked the king, send a letter that I might take from the king's forest. I said, okay, here's the funding for that, for the building of that. Look at chapter 2. He assessed the situation and got all the information that he could. He'd got a report that the wall was laying down flat, but what did he do now in chapter 2? Went and saw it for himself. He got on the donkey and went out and surveyed the city. No one else knew that he was there except for his God, and he never told anyone, but he surveyed the whole city, and then he comes back after assessing the circumstance and said, let us rise up and build. So he gets the information. Then chapter 2, beginning at verse 17, he stirred others to action. He called them together and made a little speech saying, let us rise up and build. But he talked to them about the reproach we will be if we don't do that. He talked to them, what else did he talk to them about? We're going to face opposition, verse 19. Verse 20, don't forget that God's going to be with us. God's going to prosper us. And so he stirred them to action, so much so that the people said to him, let us rise up and build. All right. Then look at chapter 3. He organized. Now this was mentioned earlier, that he delegated. He delegated. So he organized and appointed others to work. Chapter 3 is one of those boring chapters, and I put that in quotation. It's not really boring, but you get to that and it's a bunch of names and you say, well, I don't get this, so let's skip on to chapter 4. It's an important chapter because it talked about this family worked from this gate to this gate, and this family worked there with them, and this family worked with them, and then from this gate to this gate, these families worked, and from this gate to this gate. So he appointed people. Here's where you work. You're not all working on the same section. He delegated. He's not building the whole wall. He can't do that. He appointed others to do the work, and he had a plan where all were to work. There were some who didn't put their shoulders to the work, according to chapter 3. You'll remember that at verse 5. Some didn't put their shoulder to the work, but nonetheless, most of them did. In fact, some people were so eager to work that when they finished their section, they went and helped somebody else. All right. Anything else on achieving that goal before we go further? Had a major goal. Here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to get there. Sometimes goals are so broad without any specifics. What if a coach said, here's our goal. We're going to win the games. All right, that's good. How? Now, that's the hard part. That's the hard part. How are we going to do that? How are we going to take this team and make them winners? How can we do that? Saying we'll rebuild the wall is not all that hard. How we're going to accomplish that takes some leadership. Making sense? All right, let's go to number 10. He communicated with those he led. He communicated with those he led. How did he communicate and what did he communicate? Absolutely. He informed them, here's the problem that you already know, but I'm telling you the problem, the city lies waste, number one. Number two, here's the plan for doing it. What else did he say? Say again?
He had to motivate them to get busy.
All right, he had to motivate them for doing that. Jared? Yeah, we're going to suffer reproach. There's a very powerful lesson here, and that is many of an eldership has failed and diminished because they didn't communicate effectively in either direction, in listening and in giving information. I've held meetings in a number of places where the church seemed to be thriving, things going well, they had elders, and then I go back 5 or 6 years later and the numbers have dropped drastically, and I ask, what in the world happened here? What went on? Where'd everybody go? Had a bunch of people leave. Why? Well, they didn't think the elders were communicating. Whether that was true or not, that would be the charge in a number of places where I've been. Communication is very, very important. All right, he presented the plan, communicated with those he led. He was a positive thinker. God will get us through this. God will help us to build this. I'm just going to mention that quickly. Look at chapter 4 and verse 9. He watched for and was alerted to danger. He watched for. We made prayer to God because we set a watch against them day and night. This is with Sanballat and Tobiah making their threats, giving their opposition. So he's watching and setting people, and y'all keep an eye out for the danger. And so he was very alerted to danger. Leaders that have not got their eyes open and looking around, where is the danger? I'm not talking about physical danger. I'm talking about spiritual danger. Where is the danger coming? It might be something being taught. It might be something that's creeping in, a practice. Maybe a number of things that are a threat. And so they need to keep eyes for that. Chapter 4, verse 14, he encouraged. How did he encourage? As they're building, people are being ridiculed. Their wall is being made fun of. There's rumors going around the wall about war and about being killed. And Nehemiah comes and says, say again.
Remember the Lord.
Yeah, remember the Lord. Do not be afraid, but remember the Lord. Don't be afraid of what man's saying. Remember what the Lord said. Remember the promises of God. Remember the word of God. He encouraged them. Leaders encourage. Now this one's quite interesting to me. Look at chapter 4, verse 21. He was willing to dedicate long hours. They labored, not only him, but the people as well. They worked, held spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. Verse 23 says they didn't even take their clothes off except for washing. In other words, they didn't lay down and rest very much. Worked long hours. Chapter 6:15 again, I know they worked long hours because they built the wall around the entire city of Jerusalem in how long? 52 days. Now, you want to be a leader, but you say, I'm not willing to dedicate long hours and time. It's not for you. There may be times when you go long spells without the elders having to formally meet, but there have been times where we would meet one night and we meet again the next night. And then we meet again 2 days later, and we meet for 3 or 4 hours at a time. And maybe there's a problem that's a crisis, and you may meet every day over that. And so it may be that you're going to have to dedicate long hours. And by the way, you don't get paid for that. You don't get paid for that. Not that anybody's wanting that, but I'm saying that's not a motive. Say, well, I'll stay. But no, it's service. That's what it is. That's leadership. And so you need to be willing to dedicate long hours. Now, look at chapters 4 and 5. He dealt with things that diverted attention away from the real task. Like what? These are 2 chapters. All right, there's opposition. Chapter 4. There is Sanballat, who is to the north, and then there was Tobiah to the south, and they were doing things and saying, like, what are these feeble Jews doing? Look at verse 2. Well, they fortify themselves. And look at verse 3, that Tobiah would say that even if a fox ran up upon the stone wall, it'll fall down, it'll break down. There were rumors that circulated around. There was compromise. There were conspiracy, opposition of complaint, number of oppositions that come in chapter 4. And that could easily divert attention away. But that's not what Nehemiah was willing to do. He dealt with that. All right, what in chapter 5 was something that could easily take attention away? There was a problem of usury, brethren mistreating one another. And he has to stop and deal with that before they get the wall finished. And that could divert attention away. He dealt with it, but they kept building the wall. There are a number of things that may divert our attention away from our main work of preaching and teaching the gospel and building up the church, doing what it needs to be done. There may be problems. There may be a marriage problem over here, and there may be a personal strife problem over there. And then here's false doctrine to deal with over somewhere else. And so you've got problems to deal with, but we need to make sure that doesn't divert our attention away from our real task. Make sense? All right, let's go further. Chapter 5. He was ready to deal with problems within the group. It seemed that Nehemiah was ready. Now, how do I know that he was ready to deal with that? Because as soon as he found out about this, what did he say? It points to his readiness. Let me word it this way. He didn't say, well, I've got to think about this now, and let me see if I can find a rabbi that could tell me what the law has to say. He immediately starts. Yeah. He thought within himself, then he rebuked the nobles. But when he rebukes them, what does he say? Should you not walk in the fear of God? He's quoting Numbers. He's quoting Leviticus chapter 25, verses 36 and 43. He was familiar with that. He knew what the law said about usury, which means he was prepared to deal with this problem because he had knowledge of the Scriptures. A leader who's going to lead needs to be familiar with answers before the problem comes up, and that is he needs to be familiar with the text where the answers are found. Does that make sense? Because he immediately thought of, this is what Leviticus would have talked about. This is violation of that principle of Leviticus. So he was ready to deal with those problems. Let's quickly list the rest. Verse 7 of chapter 5, just mentioned a moment ago, after serious thought, he rebuked the nobles. What does that tell you? Absolutely. Didn't fly off the handle. He wasn't, as Larry mentioned a moment ago, wasn't driven by emotion. He had control of himself. He gave serious thought. He thought things through. He didn't act and then think about it later. I overacted there. He thought things through. Leaders need to think things through. What are you going to do? Well, let me think about this just a minute. Let me think for a little bit, and let's come up with the proper solution. Then notice in chapter 6, he resisted compromise on principle. They asked him to come down on the plains of Ono, and he thought that to be a compromise. I'm doing the work of the Lord. Why should I leave the work of the Lord and stop that to come and meet with you? Not going to do it. And so he would not compromise on principle. There's a difference in compromising on principle and in compromising on judgment. Would you agree? Do elders ever have to compromise on judgment? They better, or they never will get anything accomplished. Should elders compromise on principle of what's right? Got a 50-50 chance of getting that one right. Or wrong. No, never compromise on principle. Not on principle, but on judgment. Yes, he was unwilling to compromise on principle. Number 19, he was able to identify and deal with false teachers. where someone came to him. Notice in chapter 6, verses 11 and 12, there was a false teacher that came to him and told him that he need to go to the temple and flee for his life and claim to be a prophet. And he said, I knew that. No, that ain't right. He's not a prophet of God. So he was able to detect that one is teaching false, and he identified them as a false teacher. Leaders who can't do that are asking for trouble. Quickly, I just mentioned he taught the word. We'll come back to that a little bit later in another study. He dealt with sin and problems of the wrong crowd and compromise and things being neglected, the failure in worship and wrong marriages. All of those were dealt with in chapter 13. You think he had problems in chapter 4? Look at the problems. They were mixing with the wrong people. They were compromising. They were neglecting worship. There were commands they were not fulfilling, wrong marriages, and he deals with all of that in chapter 13. And then last of all, he did what he expected of others. What does that mean? Yeah, he led by example. He hung the gates, chapter 5. In other words, he's working on the wall. He's not sitting in his ivory house over here looking out the window, and I hope y'all get busy and get that finished. The gate needs to be hung. Nehemiah's out there hanging the gate. He's doing whatever he expects of everybody else. When somebody needed to be helped, he was willing to help, and that he did, as we see in chapter 1, 7 in verse 1, and chapter 5, verses 10 and 11. All right, questions or comments on that before we go to one of our scenarios? Great qualities of a great leader in Nehemiah. All right, we may not get both of these. If we don't, we'll save the other one for next time, and we'll try to deal with it then. Let's take the first scenario that we have. If you were not here last week, what these are real case scenarios that either we have had to deal with as elders, or I've heard of another eldership somewhere, or some church dealing with. These are all real live, real circumstance scenarios. So here's the scenario. You're one of the elders. The local preacher teaches the truth. He's a good man. However, he's not a good speaker. His sermons are long-winded and dry as powder, and people are beginning to leave to place membership elsewhere. How would you handle this as one of the elders? All right, good point. It's gone on for a long time by the time it reaches this point, perhaps. Good point. How would you deal with it? Now remember, you're one of the elders. You're pretending and answering. You're one of the elders, so it's kind of hard to say, I'm not sure what they're going to do. It's what are we going to do? Okay? And you're right, it won't. Something's got to be addressed. Good point.
I think about Paul, he was not an eloquent speaker, but he taught the truth. The thing about, the only thing I would consider is maybe speaking with the teacher and seeing if he could either maybe shorten the sermons, maybe just timeline, or just, he's preaching the truth. It's really hard for me to understand. Get rid of it.
Okay? Sure. Good point.
There's a couple of biblical principles, and this one, we may not think about, but 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 talks about being equipped. Now, not saying that he's not equipped with the word, but he may not be equipped with the eloquence of speaking. And also, the parable of the talents in Matthew 20:25. So, what we received better, and it's not pushing people away.
All right, good point. Ricky had his hand up. Now I want to ask some questions.
He was saying a lot of what I was going to say, but the thing too is you need to go to the preacher and identify that there's an issue, and can you assist him in identifying his weaknesses and his strengths. Just don't let the guy go automatically. You give him an opportunity to improve, and after a certain time frame, if your expectations of improvement haven't been met, then it may be time to let him go.
All right, good observation. These are all good comments. Let me get here, then I'll ask my questions.
I was gonna say, the first thing I would wanna do is ensure that there is actions upon, because a lot of times you can look at a conversation.
Say this a little louder, because this is where I was going. Say this louder, everybody can hear it.
The first thing I would wanna do is understand that this is action upon. In a lot of congregations in my lifetime, people get antsy at 11:50 or 10:50. Service supposed to be over at 11. So is this actually the problem? Is this preacher, or are their expectations too high of that preacher? So I would want to understand first and foremost, is it this preacher or is it not?
Good observation. And I like what you're saying. Do we have enough information here to make a decision? No, we don't. Like Nehemiah, we need to get more information. So it may be that, as mentioned earlier, if this has gone on, the elders should have addressed this perhaps earlier. But one of the things is it as bad as the claim is? Is the preaching as dry as powder, as they say? Or is it just not exciting like some other preacher? That may be the case. It may be that that some are overacting without basis. It may be truth is being taught. It may not be as dry and as long-winded as some make out. Or it may be. It may be. Is it as long-winded as they think? Is he hard to follow? I've heard guys, when they get through preaching, I didn't know if he's preaching on marriage or on the Holy Spirit. Literally, I had no clue which one. Or something else. I don't know if he's based out of the Old or New Testament. I couldn't tell because he's quoting everything and making no points. So are people able to follow him? So the first thing I do is ask the other elders, do we really have a problem here? Number one. Secondly, we might talk to those leaving. What might we ask those who are leaving? Why they're leaving. Why do I need to ask that? Yeah. Is it his poor job preaching the reason they're leaving, or are they using him as a scapegoat? That could be the case. Might not, but it could be. That could be the case. So I want more information as to why they're leaving. I may find out more. Then we may, and I'm shortening the answer because our time is gone, we might go talk to the preacher, as some of you have already suggested. And we might point out to him what? Yeah, we might get an assessment from him of what's going on, but relate to him how serious the complaints are, and we might ask him to tighten his material. Those who've studied with me in preacher training know what that means. Tighten your material. Shorten your material, maybe. We might give him some suggestions for improvement. And if he shows no signs of trying to work on that, then we may have another course to take. In the final analysis, the elders have to think about the congregation. Are they being taught? Are they being fed? And so is there anything unscriptural with making a change in preachers? No. That's the elder's choice. They may have to do that. We may have to consider the impact on the church. And so what I want you to see in that is, you tell me, not just in this scenario, but all scenarios. The bigger picture. It's not always easy. Get all the facts, It's not a simple cut and dry answer that, I tell you what we'd do, we just fire the preacher on the spot, or we would just tell him to get better and he's going to get better, or tell these people they just need to get over it. There's a lot to consider. And there's a lot of people to talk to. There's the people who are leaving we need to consider. There's the people who are still here that may be complaining that we need to consider. The preacher we need to consider. And so it's not a simple one-answer decision. Does that make sense? That's what we're wanting to see from all these scenarios, the difficulty of working through some of those. We'll save the next one. Our time is gone. Keep this piece of paper and the next one. We'll try to work through both of those. If not, we'll work through this one first, and then the one handed out tonight we'll work through next.